John Brown's last speech, November 2nd, 1859. I have, may it please the court, a few words to say. In the first place, I deny everything but what I have all along admitted, the design on my part to free the slaves. I intended, certainly, to have made a clear thing of that matter, as I did last winter when I went into Missouri, and there took slaves without the snapping of a gun on either side, moved them through the country, and finally left them in Canada. I designed to have done the same thing again on a larger scale. That was all I intended. I never did intend murder, or treason, or the destruction of property, or to excite or incite slaves to rebellion, or to make insurrection. I have another objection, and that is, it is unjust that I should suffer such a penalty had I interfered in the manner which I admit, and which I admit has been fairly proved, for I admire the truthfulness and candor of the greater portion of the witnesses who have testified in this case. Had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, brother, sister, or wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have in this interference, it would have been all right, and every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. This court acknowledges, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament, that teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that men should do unto me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. I endeavor to act up to that instruction. I say, I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, was not wrong, but right, everlasting right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done. Let me say one word further. I feel entirely satisfied with the treatment I have received on my trial. Considering all the circumstances, it has been more generous than I expected, but I feel no consciousness of guilt. I have stated from the first what was my intention and what was not. I never had any design against the life of any person, not any disposition to commit treason or excite slaves to rebel or make any general insurrection. I never encouraged any man to do so, but always discouraged any idea of that kind. Let me say also a word in regard to the statements made by some of those connected with me. I hear it has been stated by some of them that I have induced them to join me, but the contrary is true. I do not say this to injure them, but as regretting their weakness. There is not one of them but joined me of his own accord, and the greater part of them at their own expense. A number of them I never saw, and never had a word of conversation with, till the day they came to me, and that was for the purpose I have stated. Now I have done. Now I have done. Now I am done. Now I am done. Now I am done. Osborne Anderson was the only black person who survived to write about the experience of the raid on Harper's Ferry. Let's get back to that. I want to kind of briefly just read over this other book, which is the same speech, but I don't know if they have the same words, so let's just kind of... I have, may it please the court, a few words to say. In the first place, I deny everything but what I have all along admitted, the design on my part to free the slaves. It's in English. We're English. Why the fuck would it, any of the words change? So, seems like now I have done. Okay, let's read the aftermath. A contemporary record of the trial says, while Mr. Brown was speaking, perfect quiet prevailed. And when he had finished, the judge proceeded to pronounce sentence upon him. After a few preliminary remarks, he said that no reasonable doubt could exist of the guilt of the prisoner, and sentenced him to be hung in public on Friday, the 2nd of December next. Mr. Brown received his sentence with composure. The only demonstration made was by the clapping of the hands of one man in the crowd who is not a resident of Jefferson County. This was promptly suppressed, and much regret is expressed by the citizens at its occurrence. From prison, Brown wrote his wife he was sure he could recover all the lost capital occasioned by that disaster at Harper's Ferry by only hanging a few minutes by the neck, and I feel quite determined to make the utmost possible out of a defeat, refusing even to consider a plan of escape which his friends in the North had been hatching. He repeatedly explained that his death would be worth infinitely more to the cause than his continued life. The ambitious and erratic Governor Wise of Virginia unwittingly cooperating instead of demeaning Brown by clapping him in the prison for the criminally insane. He magnified both the character of the man and of his conspiracy and hurried him toward martyrdom. Permitted extraordinary freedom to carry on correspondence, Brown had another month for establishing his own stature. Meanwhile, in the North, the aloof Emerson and the fiery Wendell Phillips gave glowing speeches in Brown's behalf. 3 months later, Lincoln gave the address at the Cooper Union, which led directly to his nomination for the presidency by the Republican Party. He was empathetic in disassociating himself and the Republicans from any sympathy with Brown's act. That affair and its philosophy corresponds with the many attempts related in history at the assassination of kings and emperors. An enthusiast broods over the oppression of a people till he fancies himself commissioned by heaven to liberate them. He ventures the attempt which ends in little else than his own execution. However, Lincoln's words could not erase the effect of the Brown affair on the minds of the North and the South, nor did they prevent the latter Lincoln of John Brown's name with Lincoln's an American legend. An American legend. Okay. So Harper's Ferry, huh? So yeah, John Brown basically just did what Lincoln did by small scale. So John Brown goes, to the gallows. Abraham Lincoln gets written into the history. He got assassinated. They both got martyred. For freeing the slaves. How many wars in this? We've had 50 wars in America. I would say there's only 3 holy wars. The Revolutionary War, I go back and forth, but basically revolution is good, so the scales tip in the favor of that one. But this is Howard Zinn too, right? Howard Zinn said the 3 holy wars was the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, and World War II. Wouldn't that be crazy to look at American history and not only support all the 90% of the crappy wars, but be against the holy wars? It's like you're just on the side of wickedness and mass murder. You don't have a... I gotta stop talking to people with no souls. Osborne P. Anderson, a voice from Harper's Ferry, 1861. Of the various contradictory reports made by slaveholders and their satellites about the time of the Harper's Ferry conflict, none were more untruthful than those relating to the slaves. There was seemingly a studied attempt to enforce the belief that slaves were cowardly and that they were really more in favor of Virginia masters and slavery than of their freedom. As a party who had an intimate knowledge of the conduct of the colored men engaged and prepared to make an emphatic denial of the gross imputation against them, they were charged especially with being unreliable, with deserting Captain Brown at the first opportunity and going back to their masters, and with being so indifferent to the work of their salvation from the yoke as to be forced into service by the captain contrary to their will. On the Sunday evening of the outbreak, when we visited the plantations and acquainted the slaves with our purpose to effect their liberation, the greatest enthusiasm was manifested by them. Joy and hilarity beamed from every countenance. One old mother, white-haired from age and borne down with the labors of many years in bonds, when told of the work in hand, replied, "God bless you, God bless you." She then kissed the party at her house and requested all to kneel, which we did, and she offered prayer to God for his blessings on the enterprise and our success. At the slaves' quarters, there was apparently a general jubilee, and they stepped forward manfully without impressing or coaxing. In one case only was there any hesitation. A dark-complexioned, free-born man refused to take up arms. He showed the only want of confidence in the movement and far less courage than any slave consulted about the plan. In fact, so far as I could learn, the free blacks of the South are much less reliable than the slaves and infinitely more fearful. In Washington City, a party of free colored persons offered their services to the mayor to aid in suppressing our movement of the slaves who followed us to the ferry. Some were sent to help remove stores, and the others were drawn up in a circle around the engine house at one time, where they were, by Captain Brown's order, furnished by me with pikes mostly, and acted as a guard to the prisoners to prevent their escape, which they did. As in the War of the American Revolution, the first blood shed was a black man's, Crispus Attucks. So at Harper's Ferry, the first blood shed by our party after the arrival of the United States troops was that of a slave. In the beginning of the encounter, and before the troops had fairly emerged from the bridge, a slave was shot. I saw him fall. Of the men shot on the rocks, when John Henry Caggie's party were compelled to take to the river, some were slaves, and they suffered death before they would desert their companions, and their bodies fell into the waves beneath. Captain Brown, who was surprised and pleased by the promptitude with which they volunteered and with their manly bearing at the scene of violence, remarked to me on that Monday morning that he was agreeably disappointed in the behavior of the slaves, for he did not expect 1 out of 10 to be willing to fight. The truth of the Harper's Ferry raid, as it has been called, in regard to the part taken by the slaves and the aid given by colored men generally, demonstrates clearly, first, that the conduct of the slaves is a strong guarantee of the weakness of the institution should a favorable opportunity occur, and secondly, that the colored people as a body were well represented by numbers both in the fight and in the number who suffered martyrdom afterwards. The first report of the number of insurrectionists killed was 17, which showed that several slaves were killed, for there were only 10 of the men that belonged to the Kennedy farm who lost their lives at the ferry, namely John Henry Caggie, Jerry Anderson, Watson Brown, Oliver Brown, Stuart Taylor, Adolphus Thompson, William Lehman, all 8 whites, and Dangerfield Newby and Sherrard Lewis Leary, both colored. The rest reported dead according to their own showing were colored. Captain Brown had but 17 with him belonging to the farm, and when all was over, there were 4 besides himself taken to Charlestown prisoners, viz. A.D. Stevens, Edwin Coppock, White, J.A. Copeland, and Shields Green, colored. It is plain to be seen from this that there was a proper percentage of colored men killed at the ferry and executed at Charlestown. Of those that escaped from the fangs of the human bloodhounds of slavery, there were 4 whites and 1 colored man, myself being the sole colored man of those at the farm. That hundreds of slaves were ready and would have joined in the work had Captain Brown's sympathies not been aroused in favor of the families of his prisoners, and that a very different result would have been seen in consequence, there is no question. There was abundant opportunity for him and the party to leave a place in which they held entire sway and possession before the arrival of the troops, and so cowardly were the slave holders proper that from Colonel Lewis Washington, the descendant of the father of his country, General George Washington, they were easily taken prisoners. They had not pluck enough to fight, nor to use the well-loaded arms in their possession. They but were concerned rather in keeping a whole skin by parleying, or in spilling cowardly tears to excite pity, as did Colonel Washington, and that way escape merited punishment. No, the conduct of the slaves was beyond all praise, and could our brave old captain have steeled his heart against the entreaties of his captives, or shut up the fountain of his sympathies against their families, could he for the moment have forgotten them in the selfish thought of his own friends and kindred, or by adhering to the original plan could have left the place and thus looked forward to the prospective freedom of the slave, hundreds ready and waiting would have been armed before 24 hours had elapsed. As it was, even the noble old man's mistakes were productive of great good, the fact of which the future historian will record without the embarrassment attending its present narration. John Brown did not only capture and hold Harper's Ferry for 20 hours, but he held the whole South. He captured President James Buchanan and his cabinet, convulsed the whole country, killed Governor Henry Wise, and dug the mine and laid the train which will eventually dissolve the union between freedom and slavery. The rebound reveals the truth. So let it be. So let it be. Let it be. Let it be. Let it